Nobody likes the idea of one day ending up in divorce court, but it happens. And with it comes property distribution. At that point, there's not much you can do to protect assets, but there are steps you can take ahead of time. One possibility is a prenuptial agreement, a contract that specifically identifies property brought into the marriage, how it will be treated during the marriage, and how property, individual and joint, will be dealt with if the union ends. But prenuptial agreements are not very common. Most divorces are from first marriages. The parties were young when they got married. They didn't have much. So most property was acquired during the marriage. If you receive assets in your name alone, commingling of funds becomes the determining factor. Were your individual assets mixed with marital assets, and can they still be identified as just yours?
So when it comes to separate property, one of the keys, if you want to keep it separate, is making sure that you keep it really well insulated from marital property. I advise people very often, if you inherit large sums of money, not only to create a separate account for that money, I often advise people keep it at a separate financial institution so no one can ever say, hey, that was part of our SunTrust account, that was part of our Bank of America account.
You'd think IRAs would be an easily identifiable asset because it's an individual retirement account, but not always.
Let's take an example that someone gets married when they're 40, right? And they bring an IRA into the marriage. What they brought into a marriage was their separate property, okay? That accounts at $20,000. When they get divorced, that accounts at $30,000. Their spouse doesn't get half of the 30, right? They'd only be entitled to the appreciation. And depending on how high these numbers go, and sometimes they go high, you may want to get a forensic accountant to look at how much of that appreciation was actually the growth on the separate property, right? Because if I brought $100,000 into this marriage, you don't get to enjoy the benefit if we divorce of the income that was earned off that $100,000. You can divide how it's increased.
In a different scenario, if someone wants to give assets to a loved one, there are steps that can be taken to protect the person receiving the gift in case of divorce.
If you're a grandparent, you don't know that your grandchildren's marriages are going to last forever. And frankly, if it ends, you want that to be for the benefit of your grandchild, right? So if I were doing that, I would use the most plain language possible to indicate it is going to grandchild A, right? It's going to John or Frank, whatever the name is. We'll use Bob as a name, it's a good name. If it's going to Bob in his individual capacity, and I would just use that language, it is his individual capacity as his separate property. I think the safest way to make sure that property is going to be is number one, to have a conversation with the child, and if the child's too young, have a conversation with their parent about why you're structuring it this way, and to make sure, again, the key word there is insulation, to make sure it's granted in a separate capacity, it's given in a separate capacity in that name, and that it is insulated from that marriage.
Protecting assets from divorce requires advanced planning. Remember, the most important steps include make sure it's in your name. Don't commingle assets. And if a loved one wants to give you a gift, set up proper procedures to insulate that gift and avoid commingling. More useful information is on the way, so subscribe to the Alhambra Investments channel.